It's a great pleasure to invite you to our next webinar, which is entitled Broadband on the Hill, a legislative update. We're very pleased to have three all-star speakers today to talk to you about the prospects for broadband legislation in the Congress that has been working on broadband so far already, and there may be more to come this summer. In fact, I've never seen a Congress so busy addressing so many different pieces of broadband legislation. It's really chock full of legislative bills being introduced and conversations. So we're very pleased to bring this webinar to you today. Just as a note, the SHLB Coalition has put together a legislative tracker where we are following all of these different broadband bills, and that is available to our members. And so we will make that available to our membership. But the purpose of this webinar today is really to try to get some insight between the lines. So we are going to have some slides that will give you some basic information about a lot of these broadband bills. But what's really special about this webinar is we have three experts who can provide some amazing intelligence about what's really going on beyond just the words on the page. So we're very excited to bring this to you today. A few opening notes about the logistics. We want to thank you for tuning in, but also thank our sponsor, Education Networks of America, that allows us to bring these webinars to you. All the audience members are muted during the call, but you are welcome to send in your questions and comments using the chat feature, and we will do our best to respond to those as the webinar goes forward. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for on the SHLB website tomorrow. So if you have a colleague that misses it today, it will be online and available for the next 30 days. We also encourage you to follow along online by tweeting at the SHLB Coalition and using the hashtag SHLB webinars. And we invite you to correspond and continue the conversations on all these social media. So it's my pleasure to introduce our three all-star speakers today. We're going to start off with Kelsey Griffiths, who is a senior telecom reporter with Law 360. Kelsey is going to serve as the moderator of this conversation. And if you don't know Kelsey and her work, you really ought to get to know her. And she does a fabulous job covering broadband legislation and regulatory issues. And Law 360 is just a great publication. So if you haven't taken a look at Kelsey's work, I encourage you to do so. We also have Asad Ramzanali, who's the legislative director for Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. Asad has been so great to work with. We had a number of late night and weekend calls as we were working with your office, putting together the rural healthcare bill that we're going to be talking about in a couple of minutes. So Asad has just been great to work with. And then Joey Wender, and he's with Senator Markey, the senior policy advisor for Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts. I guess the best thing I could say about Joey is everybody knows him as Joey. You know, all you have to do is tell a staffer, well, you talk to Joey, and they know immediately who you were referring to because he's so well known, he's so well liked, and he really is an expert on broadband policy. And Ed Markey, of course, one of the authors of the E-rate program. We're going to talk a lot about the prospects for E-rate reform coming up. So with that, I'm happy to turn the microphone over to Kelsey Griffiths for a few comments, and then we'll plunge into the conversation. Kelsey, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here today, John. And I'm excited to be speaking with you, Asad, and Joey. Obviously, following things on the Hill has kind of taken a new turn because many of us are not able to be on the Hill right now. So it's great to be here with you all and to get a bit of an up-close perspective about some of the activity that's going on that maybe we haven't been able to follow along in person. So obviously the HEROES Act is one of the big bills that I've been following. It passed in the House on May 15th, as you see here on the slide. And it did involve a lot of pieces of broadband infrastructure, consumer protection measures, and things that fall under my telecom beat and your interest as well. So I was wondering if maybe we could kind of start off with talking about the big picture prospects for this bill. It was obviously a big push from House Democrats, did pretty well in the House, but now it's facing a very different landscape in the Senate. So maybe Joey and Asad as well, what could you tell us about where this bill is at and what we should expect from it?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Kelsey and John for helping to host this event. I think it's very timely, extremely timely, as we're all connecting to each other virtually, and it just shows how needed broadband is just generally in the country. And we'll get to all the specifics throughout the call. So the House passed the bill. The Senate Republican leadership, I think, they expected that to happen. And I think they view it as the Democrats in the House opening offer. And so if you take a step back here, we've gone through 3.5 rounds, we'll call it, of stimulus bills. The big one being CARES 3, it was the Stimulus 3.0, the CARES Act. And then there was a 3.5 Act that was passed in between that. And so now everybody knows there's going to be a Stimulus 4. Don't know exactly what it's going to be called, but was it CARES 2.0 or is it whatever the case may be? It's a Stimulus 4. It will likely total in the trillions of dollars, like Stimulus 3. And it's likely that the Senate will take it up at some point this summer. We were talking on a pre-call, McConnell is stuck between fiscal conservatives on one side, right? And on the obvious political imperative of continuing to boost up the economy. We have an election coming up. Trump is on the ballot. He's got a lot of vulnerable Republicans. And so, the running assumption is that there will be another stimulus bill, but probably only just one more before the election. And so the Senate's received the bill. Obviously, we love everything that's in it because I work for a Democrat and it was passed out of a Democratic House. But now the real negotiations, the real conversations in the Senate are now starting to happen, and we'll go through those specifics throughout the next hour.
Excellent. Well, Asad, what can you tell us about getting this out the door in the House? What was that process like, and what are some of the provisions that you most hope will make it through the Senate process as well?
Yeah, so I'll start by echoing the thanks that Joey started with. Thank you, Shelby, for hosting this and for having us. And it is a timely and really important discussion to be having. On the House side, I think what Joey said, it tracks for me kind of at the macro level of how things are fitting. On the House side, this was a serious piece of legislation. This wasn't just, a few ideas put in a piece of paper and said, okay, agencies go figure out how to help. We spent a lot of time on each of these provisions, and we got into the details to make sure that it's legitimate, legislation that can move forward. And so we're not seeing it as kind of all right, here's kind of a rough draft. We're seeing it as a real strong bill that we're proud of as a caucus. And so that's where we're hopeful that we obviously want the next piece of legislation to be sooner rather than later, and that's part of the idea of getting the HEROES Act out the door. But it wasn't just what can we do quickly over a weekend, right? There was a lot of hard work that went into it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you'll forgive me if I call, you might want to correct some of this language here, but as I was going through the bill, I saw some provisions that were obviously clearly related to the coronavirus response. And then there were some other provisions that seemed to maybe reflect some more long-standing Democratic priorities that have been included in the bill. Can you tell us about some of those? The one that immediately comes to my mind is this, the prison phone justice piece of this, which has obviously been in the conversation for a long time. How do you see some of these provisions that Senate Republicans might not see as maybe as closely tied to this coronavirus response? What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that each of the ones on this sheet of paper, but certainly in the whole bill, are pretty closely linked to the coronavirus. I mean, I have not worked on the prison phone justice bill. I'm familiar with it, but I read the New York Times and I know how much of an issue there is with telecommunications and prisons in general, but also specifically right now, the coronavirus spreading through prisons has been a major problem. So I think there is a pretty salient hook, but the message from leadership to us has been pretty clear that this is a coronavirus aid package, right? This did not include a lot of the broader broadband infrastructure pieces that we've been talking about for years. We could have, right? There could have been more, but this is all the stuff that has the clear nexus to the coronavirus.
Got it. Yep, that makes sense. Anything else you wanted to add, John, before we move into some of these, the more specifics of the healthcare and broadband provisions in HEROES Act?
Well, actually, yeah, I would like to, based on what Asad just said, a question does occur to me that Mr. Clyburn and this Rural Broadband Task Force has been working on an $80 billion package. And at one point, the idea was, well, let's pass the HEROES Act first, and then we'll turn to this infrastructure later on after we know what's in the HEROES Act. But if the HEROES Act doesn't move forward in the Senate, how does that Mr. Clyburn's infrastructure work play into the broader bill that Joey was talking about earlier? Any sense of how that dynamic will work?
Yeah, I think there's still interest in getting movement on a broadband infrastructure package. I mean, Mr. Clyburn had said he's working on that at beginning, I want to say like in the fall last year, right? Like he put together a task force, the Rural Broadband Task Force that had been working on this for some time. So it wasn't a like, let's cobble something together. The thinking, at least for me, on why that makes sense is this is both a healthcare problem and an economic problem. Infrastructure is, according to most economists, a great way to invest in our economy, right? The multiplier effect on investments in infrastructure are pretty high. Broadband infrastructure, I think most people on this call probably agree, is a very important part of that discussion. So we think there's a lot of relevance. Now, we have some pieces in Mr. Clyburn's bill that he's publicly announced as well. So we're very supportive of that effort. But it's to be seen how that moves or when that moves or what the discussion will be.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we can move on to our next slide, which is going to get into some of these healthcare broadband expansion measures that would specifically target COVID-19. And if I'm not mistaken, this is included in HEROES Act. Someone correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So could one of you give us, maybe Asad from the House side, just kind of a wrap up of what this particular bill would do and what's going to happen if the Senate doesn't take it up?
Yeah, so this bill, it expands on the FCC's rural healthcare program, which is part of their universal service program. That program provides hospitals with money for broadband. The short version of the story is hospitals are going through a number of crises, but one big change that we've seen is a double-digit increase in the percentage use of telehealth. Now that has a lot of implications on the amount of broadband, the amount of bandwidth they need, the broadband costs that they're facing. They also happen to be going through a lot of financial difficulties as well. So the program, as it already exists, subsidizes broadband for hospitals. We think the hook to coronavirus is very clear here. I will give another big thank you to John. All those late night and weekend calls were in part for this bill to make sure that this legislation was smart and effective. But the idea is there's an existing program, an existing mechanism to get money to hospitals for connectivity. We should use that. So it increases the discount rate. It makes a number of administrative changes to get money out the door quickly, but it's $2 billion to hospitals for connectivity. We're excited that it was included in the HEROES Act. It is bipartisan, bicameral, supported by over 50 hospitals, many of which are part of SHLB or on this call. So we really appreciate the support, but we're excited that there's momentum behind that.
Great. Joey, what are you seeing from your perch in the Senate as far as movement on this bill, support, and prospects of it passing?
Sure. So, and I agree with everything Asad said, and we're supportive of the bill. We're one of those three Democrats. Senator Markey is one of the three Democrats that is an original co-sponsor of Senator Schatz's bill in the Senate. There's a theme that's going to emerge here, so I want to take a step backwards here. You'll see this in healthcare. You'll see this in E-rate. You'll see this in Lifeline, that there is a consistent effort, and I think a smart effort, to, as Asad said, leverage existing programs in order to get money out the door fast to get people better connected. That there's a real immediacy to this problem right now. I mean, we are very much in it today. And, you know, the fear is if we start creating new programs, it just takes so long for those to get up and running when the assistance was needed yesterday, right? We wish this was already has become law. It's evident these needs have existed. I mean, we'll see this in distance learning. We'll see this in basic connectivity. We'll see this on healthcare. We'll see this across the board. The need was there in March, and here we are at the end of May, and we're continuing to debate them. And so if you're able to funnel money into existing programs, I mean, I just labeled or just named the three of the four existing USF programs. We think it'll be effective. It'll be quick, and it'll get the relief out that's needed. And so, you know, I would put healthcare in the bucket of things that the Senate knows that if we're going to do a broadband bill, there should be money for this. Now, the question is going to become, and I apologize for continuously stepping back, but, you know, ultimately, this is going to be a conversation of how big is the pie and how many slices are there going to be. I mean, that's going to be the whole debate, because I don't think there's not that much disagreement on, yeah, we should spend more money on healthcare. We should spend more money on distance learning. We should spend more money connecting low-income individuals with better broadband. I mean, these are truisms. We agree on a lot of this stuff. The question is, okay, how many more priorities are out there? How many more people are going to come up and raise their hand and say, I want a piece of that money? Because in the end, there's going to be a total number that the appropriators and McConnell and Pelosi and Schumer and McCarthy are going to negotiate on how much money will there be for broadband. And then that's going to have to get split up between all the various competing priorities. So this is definitely in the game for sure. Everybody knows it's an enormous problem and absolutely essential during the COVID pandemic. So we will see how the negotiation goes.
So Joey, that brings me to the next point I wanted to bring up. The FCC has obviously been very busy authorizing some emergency funds to these rural healthcare facilities that I believe came from funding in the last rescue package for telehealth. Right. How are those efforts going from your perspective? And Asad and John, obviously feel free to chime in here. And what else do you think is needed from the congressional side to expand this type of care?
Well, you are right. You know, there was $200 million in the last package for telehealth, and we know that the awards have been going out, and the money's been going out the door. Look, our basic point, and I'll obviously defer to Asad since he drafted this provision, is that the amount that was in Stimulus 3.0 was just too low. It's obvious that we just need so much more. The scale of this problem is so great, and the longevity of the problem is likely to be so long that what was included in the last package is just not nearly enough.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that and say totally agree on the total dollar amount. I mean, what we've proposed is an order of magnitude more than what was in the CARES Act, right? We're not talking about 30% more here. We're saying we need 10 times more. And I probably got on John's last nerves on how much I got into the details on why is it $2 billion? Every dollar needs to be figured out perfectly. We went through many versions of figuring out the right math here. The other thing I'll say is Joey made a really insightful point previously on using existing programs. This kind of new program that was created, we're in favor of all the money that's been committed to the hospitals that have been committed to. I think the FCC has been pretty thoughtful on who's getting the commitments. But my boss asked a question on an FCC briefing that the Energy and Commerce Committee had 2 weeks ago, where she said, "Hey, you've made 7 rounds of commitments. How many checks have been sent? How many dollars have been sent to actual hospitals?" And the answer is they've received one invoice for reimbursement. Now that's in part a they had to kind of create the airplane as they were flying it, right? And that's where our thought comes into, well, there is a program that exists and it's not that hard. Our healthcare bill is not that long. It's not that many like administrative things you need to change to like get it to a spot where checks can go out quickly. But that's our thinking is the short answer is you need to get money out the door quickly, not just commitments, not just press releases, but actual checks to hospitals.
Right. So that's kind of the difference between money that's appropriated and money that's dispersed in these bills. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying the difference between the FCC's program that they've been doing, which again, I think, look, we disagree with how it was created, but it's a good thing that money is moving to hospitals. But administratively, it's being created, right? Like as it's going. We heard from hospitals there was issues with, the initial forms and not being available and having to figure out like kind of ad hoc mechanisms. That's all fine. That happens when you create a new program. But that's why we have kind of been advocating to use the existing system because those kinks have been worked out in large part.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that kind of leads us into talking about E-rate as well. This is another of those existing programs under the FCC's Universal Service umbrella that is really being looked at as a vehicle for funding some pandemic responses that could address some of these more immediate needs. So as I'm aware, Senator Markey does have a bill that would expand the E-rate program to address this emergency outside of the normal balance of the program. What can you tell us about how that bill is progressing, Joey, and what kind of makes this stand out from the program as it is today?
Sure. I think you literally only have to open up a newspaper in the morning to see a story about the problems of distance learning and the challenges that low-income children face, whether they're in rural areas or urban centers or anywhere in between, on being able to continue their studies if they don't have the internet. It's that simple. And we all know that the E-rate was created in the 90s to fund connectivity for schools and libraries. It's been extremely effective. Over $50 billion has been spent on the program. But if schools are physically closed, you got to go to where the student is. And we already knew that there's a homework gap that exists in this country where, higher, middle income and, higher income families, they got internet at home. So the kid can go home, could sign on, and he can do his homework. For the low income children, for the immigrants, communities of color, if they don't have internet, they can't do their homework. Well, that problem is only exacerbated by the fact that it's not homework anymore. We're just talking about schoolwork because everything's done remotely. So we've moved from a homework gap to a learning gap, to an opportunity gap. And so what our money does is says it would fund two things. One, connectivity at home on a tech neutral basis. That can be cellular, that can be fixed. We don't want to say exactly what the solution should be because that can certainly differ depending upon the area in which the students live. And two, to make sure that there's devices in kids' hands in order to connect. You need a device that is able to connect to the internet to do distance learning. And we originally thought the number would be $2 billion. We doubled it, realizing that we weren't just talking about the remainder of this school year. We were likely talking about parts or all of the next school year. And so that's what our bill does. It's been endorsed by a huge coalition of organizations, including SHLB, which we very much thank you for that. And it's certainly top of mind amongst Senate leaders and House leaders for broadband funding in the next stimulus bill.
Now, maybe I can ask you, because this is something I've been wondering as well. Do you have a sense of why the original program was placed under the limits that it's currently under? Was this to make sure the government funds are only being spent on the school campus?
Yeah, the original program, the original program was designed to fund the physical schools and the libraries. Now, of course, we'd like, there are times when we'd like to expand it, but that's what the program's designed to do. In the same way, the cousin program is Lifeline, which Lifeline is trying to connect low-income families generally to the internet at home. So that was the thinking in the late 90s. But obviously, without COVID, there's a homework gap. But with COVID, the problem is just so much greater and so much more exacerbated. And that's why, even though people have been talking for years about expanding the program to allow for money to be spent to connect kids at home, it's obvious that has to happen today during the coronavirus.
Got it. So this kind of provides a hook to really address this need that's only growing. John, there are some other ways that your organization is looking at to tackle this educational broadband piece. What can you tell us about SHLB's E-rate to the home proposal, and what are your prospects looking like in Congress to get this taken up?
Well, thanks, Kelsey. So I agree with so much of what Joey just talked about, and I really kudos to him and Senator Markey and Congresswoman Meng for recognizing the need to push legislation forward and fund these broadband connections for students at the home. And Joey's absolutely right. It's more than just a homework gap now. Now we're talking about a learning gap that happens all day long. And all the reports that we see indicate that school is not going to return back to normal in September. You may have some kids going to school and other kids staying at home, and it's going to be a hybrid solution, and you're going to need to have that broadband connectivity to be ubiquitous and everywhere. And so we took a look at the Meng bill and the Markey bill and said, those are good, and we support those bills, but we think we could make them a little bit better. And so we have put together some language for, as Kelsey, you just said, our E-rate to the home bill to just build off of the Markey and Meng bill. And in a couple of ways, we think our bill might actually help to solve the problem in a more comprehensive way, because we're focused a little bit more on the provision of service and not just the hotspots. And I see somebody in the chat just made a note, hotspots don't always work if the cell phone signal isn't strong enough in these rural markets. And that's exactly right. And that's why our bill takes a little bit broader look at the possibility of providing subsidies for all different kinds of services that could reach students at home, including giving the option for schools and libraries to do it themselves. And we're seeing increasing numbers of libraries and schools who are deploying wireless services and working in partnership with some WISPs, the wireless internet providers, to provide the service from the school or library building rooftop to broadcast the service to the students at the home. That should be an option. It's not always going to work, but it should be something that's available to schools and libraries as a way to solve this problem. We also think cybersecurity is a really important need. The ransomware attacks and cyber attacks on school networks are increasing dramatically over the last few years. And if these cyber attacks bring down the school's network, then all the other money that you've spent to build up the network is wasted. It's useless if the cyber attacks bring those networks down. So we think, an additional component of funding ought to go to help schools and libraries pay for these cybersecurity measures. And we did a very factual analysis working with Funds for Learning and itemizing the 7 million homes that don't have broadband today. We factored in how much it would cost to get broadband to every one of those homes, those 7 million homes, and running it through the E-rate program. That's how we came up with the $5.25 billion that we think is going to be needed to provide broadband service for a whole year. And I think that the $2 billion number that was identified early on, I think that was a very shorter term focus of maybe 3 months. And so that's why we think we're likely to have a full year's need for students to be fully connected to broadband, and a $5.25 billion is what we think the real cost is going to be if you run it through the E-rate program or provide those subsidies. So, we haven't found a sponsor yet, but we're going to continue to work on that. We do have a growing coalition of supporters behind our bill, and we want to continue working with Joey and Asad and members of both the House and the Senate to move that forward. So it's on our website, by the way. The SHLB website has all of the details of what that bill looks like. And appreciate anyone who'd like to support that bill.
Great. Now, John, how are the sponsorship prospects looking? I don't know if Asad and Joey, you want to chime in on this. is there some immediate interest, or are you still kind of building that coalition to get this some attention and some momentum?
We're still building that interest. We admittedly do not have an office yet who is willing to sponsor it, but we have had some good conversations, and we're trying to make this bipartisan as well, which I think will also help the Markey and Meng bill. You know, it doesn't help any of us if we look at this as totally a partisan measure, because it's going to, I mean, basically the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate and the Republicans have the White House. So if we're going to have any solution that has a chance of being successful, I think it needs to be bipartisan. So we're reaching out to offices on both sides of the aisle.
So that actually brings me to an audience question that someone just dropped into the chat a couple moments ago. They mentioned that they haven't seen any educational broadband sponsorship among Republicans in either chamber. Is there somewhat of a partisan divide here? Why do you think that is? And do you think it should continue?
Sure, I'm happy to take on that question. You know, E-rate has enjoyed historic bipartisan support. The E-rate benefits blue states and red states alike, rural areas and urban areas alike. And we know that there are a lot of Republicans that are very supportive of the E-rate program. We've been on record. We've done letters with Senator Sullivan and others talking about the great importance of the E-rate program. I think my assumption right now is that a lot of Republicans don't want to get ahead of their leadership. They don't want to get ahead of Chairman Wicker and Leader McConnell in this one. And so a lot of our efforts, while we know privately that there are Republicans that would be very supportive of spending more money on E-rate or Lifeline or rural healthcare or the likes, because we know that their constituents would benefit greatly from them. You know, they're I think just proceeding politically a little more cautiously right now, and they're watching this thing unfold. But I think in the end, I'm pretty confident that you know, whatever comes out of the Senate will enjoy bipartisan support, and that there certainly will be great support from Republicans for broadband funding generally.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Some good points you brought up there, Joey. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So maybe we can move on now to talking about another education bill that Asad, your boss, is pushing through. We're seeing some bills to target specific broadband needs that don't just apply to K through 12 students. Representative Eshoo, as far as I understand, has a bill that would fund some broadband connections for college students. How would that work? And what is the, I guess, goal in supporting some of these other more targeted needs that maybe don't get brought up as much in discussions?
Yeah. So building off of the discussion just now on E-rate, that's a program my boss has supported since its inception. She loves it, and we wanted to make sure that E-rate gets the attention it deserves. And this is an area where I think Joey and I agree, and a lot of people agree, let's use existing programs where they exist. This is an area where we felt like, well, the program doesn't exist. We actually need to do something here that gets money out the door to universities, because there is a related but different problem that they face. We were in part, this problem was underlined by Dr. Fauci when he gave testimony in the Senate a couple weeks ago. I think he said something to the effect of the idea that the treatment's going to be available soon, or that a vaccine will be available before re-entry of students in the fall. That's a bit of a bridge too far, I think is the term he used. And so that applies to college students. And so the difference there is college students, they are required, they're primarily working off of devices and other things that they have. And so in our minds, in a lot of people's minds, college students already have all this stuff. They already have laptops and iPads and everything else they need to succeed in school. And that's just not true when it comes to a lot of the students in need. That's just not true when it comes to Pell Grant recipients. When you look at the usage of computer labs, a lot of low-income students are dependent on those, and those have gone away. You can't just go to the computer lab to get your homework done. And if you don't have internet at home, then you're talking about the same class of problems that the students that E-rate is meant to serve, that's recreated. Now, where there's kind of a halo problem is that a lot of these lower income students are also parents. They also have families. And so that lack of internet at home creates a problem in many ways that are kind of hard to decouple at times. But what our bill does is it works through the NTIA. We wanted to keep it separate from E-rate. We wanted to make sure that this isn't competing with E-rate. We're very supportive of E-rate, and we want to make sure it gets as much money as it can, as we can get there. But the program is done through the NTIA. They have done supporting colleges for telecom infrastructure in the past. I think it was actually after the 2008 crisis they did something like this, or not like this, but with universities. But the basic idea is NTIA would give money to colleges and universities, who would then give money to students for connectivity at home. That's devices, equipment, broadband, monthly services. All of those are eligible, and we prioritize historically Black colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, rural colleges, tribal colleges, and then within each institution, they have to prioritize the lowest income students.
And it looks like you do have sponsors in both chambers. So it sounds like this is moving along as far as support.
It is. This is, we would, like Joey said, we would welcome any Republican to join. But this is one where, the telehealth bill is bipartisan. This is one where we have strong Democratic support. We continue to look for and welcome any Republican support. But this is one backed by a bunch of civil rights groups, a bunch of higher education groups, SHLB, which we're thankful of. But it has a lot of support from groups that care about these issues.
Excellent. Well, I want to make sure that we save enough time to talk about both infrastructure bills and some of the consumer bills that we're seeing related to broadband. So let's move on to our next slide. Thanks for switching that. I think Alicia did that. So we already kind of mentioned the Representative Clyburn and Upton bill from yesterday. I thought that was a pretty interesting example of actually breaking out language from the HEROES Act and making it a standalone bill to hopefully, I guess, build a coalition of support behind that. So even if HEROES gets pared down in the Senate, this might be a provision that would survive. Do any of you want to weigh in on this strategy and just overall some of the infrastructure efforts that you think are going to be successful?
I'm happy to start. I think there's obviously, and Asad talked about this much earlier in the webinar, a lot of these things are arguably coronavirus related. Now, some things are clearly I would say, so acutely needed in the very short term. When you think about E-rate, or you think about healthcare, or you think about Lifeline, we're trying to connect people right now to existing service. But obviously, there's connectivity generally is more important than ever, particularly because we're all sitting at home by ourselves, and the only reason why we're communicating is because of broadband. And so there's a ton of different areas of potential legislating on broadband for the next bill. But like with everything, anything that goes through Congress, it's going to require negotiation. Democrats have their priorities. Republicans have their priorities. There's the Kramer-Klobuchar bill, which is an ISP bailout bill. There is rip and replace language out there. That's the Huawei and other Chinese equipment bill, where they want to be able to rip it out and replace it, and that'll cost money. And that's crept into the conversation, and there's a lot of others as well. And so, you hope that Democrats and Republicans can come together, and everybody comes with their priorities, everybody comes with their lists, and we're able to have a big package where we're able to say, okay, you get these, we make some good sausage, and it passes into law. And so that's that's the hope. But again, this is going to require a tough negotiation.
So what I'm hearing is that there is just kind of this broad menu of different broadband infrastructure pieces that are all on the table right now. There's also been talk of a broader infrastructure package getting passed later this year. which of these bills or ideas that are out there do you think would be most likely to make it into that broader infrastructure package?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because I do want to mention that. My guess is we're talking about two separate bills here, Kelsey, as you just mentioned. On the one hand, there's the stimulus 4, the coronavirus 4 bill, which will include some money for broadband for the immediate connectivity needs. And then separately, there's I'll call it the elusive infrastructure bill that we've been talking about since Donald Trump was elected president, and his desire to reach across the aisle to Democrats and pass a massive infrastructure bill. And we think that obviously infrastructure is not just roads and bridges and transit and water infrastructure. It includes broadband. It's essential. You know that the president and the Democrats have been unable for now over 3 years to come to an agreement on an infrastructure package. And it's certainly not for our lack of trying. We've put many ideas on the table about what we'd want to spend money on and how we'd pay for it. But as you know, the Republicans can't figure out how to pay for it. And the Trump administration has not, their proposals have not been serious to us. You know, a lot of it was proposing privatization or a lot of private funding of infrastructure. This is one of his early plans. So I think that I know there is a desire and a will from the Democrats, and I know there's a desire from the Republicans to do a large infrastructure bill. Will that bill happen during the waning days of Trump's first term, and from my perspective, hopefully his only term? I think it's a low chance, but it's not a zero chance. But you know, the desire to do a big infrastructure bill is not going to go away, and so if it doesn't happen in 2020, you know, my hope is obviously that Joe Biden's elected president, becomes president in 21. But regardless, I think if we don't pass it in 20, you know, we'll be having a conversation in 2021 again about having this massive infrastructure bill, and ideas like Clyburn and spending $80 billion of the like. I mean, those should be front and center in that type of bill. I've said too much. Asad, please.
So just building off of that last point, I think what you said is exactly right. But the way I think of Mr. Clyburn's bill is that it is a kind of cogent collection of ideas that talks about how broadband can be expanded. Right? If you look at that list, a lot of those are individual bills that have existed. I can speak about Dig Once because that's my boss's bill. That bill was first introduced a decade ago. Right, like that idea has been out there, and pieces of it have moved and it's evolved. And I was working on it, like, you know, recently, still working, like it's still a work. But these are really important ideas that come together, and we're hopeful. I think Joey's right. We're hopeful that we can get something done as soon as possible. I think we've been ready to do that. But if the winds don't, if the stars don't align, then I think we at least put forward an idea. We have a cogent strategy, a cogent policy mix that we can at least start to work on. Whether it gets introduced formally or not, there's at least a lot of work being done in the background so that we have something.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. John, it looks like you have something to add to that as well.
Yeah, do you mind, Kelsey, if I ask Joey and Asad a follow-up question here? Because Joey, you mentioned the need to pay for these broadband bills and investments, and yet I haven't seen a need to pay for a lot of the other bills that have already passed with trillions of dollars in the CARES Act, for instance. So I understand the need to pay for like ongoing subsidy programs, but for one-time investments, and all these bills that we're looking at right now, we're all calling for one-time investments. I guess maybe except for the first one, the BIFIA, but the others are calling for one-time investments. What is the hang up? Like, why is there a so-called need to pay for these one-time investments for these broadband bills when paying for these other programs has not been necessary?
John, you are asking me the most impossible question of all, because you're trying to get my mind in the head of get inside of Mitch McConnell's head and Donald Trump's head and the rest of the Republican leadership. Look, I think you point out correctly that there is an inconsistent application of pay-fors and we'll call it, fiscal. I don't want to say the use of responsibility, but it's selectively used about when things have to be paid for and when they don't. And from the Democrats' perspective, you should always be investing in our infrastructure, right? Because investment in infrastructure generates economic growth, right? We know that to be true, whether or not it's all paid for or not up front, it does. And now that we're in this, we're in a potentially something larger than the Great Recession, entering a depression, like this is the time more than ever to be doing an infrastructure bill. So ultimately, to answer your question of why the Republicans on one hand say, we don't have to pay for these bills, but when we start talking about infrastructure, it's like, whoa, we got to find the money for that and make sure it's balanced in the budget. I don't know. I can't. I can't.
Suspect
as a liberal Democrat, it's just impossible for me to answer that question.
I suspect all of us would violently agree that the investment in infrastructure is worthy. But I think Joey's spot on in his analysis here of like, we're ready to do it, right? But there's kind of a weird, inconsistent logic at times.
Got it. Well, let's move on, if we can, now to talk about some of the consumer pieces to this. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about student needs, healthcare needs, but there are a lot of more general consumer needs as people are struggling with unemployment and an economic downturn. One bill that particularly caught my attention would expand the Lifeline program to cover some more emergency situations, offer greater reimbursement for internet services and that sort of thing. So maybe both Joey and Asad, you could talk about some of these measures that are on the table to help digital consumers stay on their feet. And what are the chances that you think some of these mechanisms will pass?
Yeah, happy to take it first. So especially when we're talking about expanding Lifeline, I think Joey talked about it early on, that it's in the bucket of existing programs that at least our bosses and many other Democrats have been supportive of, both in general and in expanding this program right now specifically. And so I was excited to see that there were provisions in HEROES that included expansion of funding for low-income folks to have access to connectivity. I'd also point, look, these are all connected problems, right? Consumers have children who are students. Consumers are themselves college students. Hospitals serve consumers. Like these are Americans. And so that's why it's hard to decouple this from the last slide of it would be great if we did spend $80 billion on improving connectivity in the whole country, because then in part you relieve the stress from some of these programs that are meant to catch the gaps in the system, right? So all that, I don't mean to go too far aside here, but the idea of expanding Lifeline, my boss just talked about that. She's supportive of it, especially right now. That need is pretty salient. So I could see that having a lot of juice behind it.
Great. Joey, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I agree with everything Asad said. I mean, Lifeline or something Lifeline or Lifeline-like is definitely on the table. I mean, to provide a service for low-income individuals who can't connect is vital, right? It's how we work, it's how we live, it's how we communicate, it's how we receive our healthcare, all the above in the Corona age. So I know something like that is definitely high on the list for the next stimulus bill. Beyond that, I think it goes into the conversation that we had a little earlier of there's a lot of ideas out there. There's a lot of good ideas out there. What makes it in, I think, is a product of how the negotiation goes between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Well, one quick note I'll add is, we've traditionally, our framing on this question has been low income communities. And I think that the one expansion to that is the recently low income or the recently financially pressured. There's 40 million Americans that are unemployed since March, right? Like all of these people, no matter what their tax return says, for their income of last year, they're feeling the struggle, and we want to make sure that their connectivity is reliable and stable.
Yeah, that's a good point, that records from last year might not really reflect the needs on the ground now because they have changed so quickly. So that reminds me of one of the fascinating pieces of a couple of these bills, at least to me. We have this one bill that would institute the moratorium on disconnections, which has been a big thing at the FCC, where providers have been voluntarily agreeing not to cut off service even if people can't pay their bills. But that's creating a big financial pressure on the companies that are providing the services. On our miscellaneous slide, I think that's the next one. There's also discussion about a bill that would help these companies kind of pay for extending service. So I'm curious to hear from both Asad and Joey, what is Congress thinking in terms of helping companies keep up these services to Americans that are struggling?
Sure, and I mentioned the Klobuchar-Kramer bill, earlier in the call. Look, we understand that these are cash flow intensive businesses. The providers, the ISPs that are providing this service, and we know that there's a lot of people that aren't paying their bills, that can't pay their bills, that might not ever be able to pay those bills back. That's real. We know that. Now, how do you do that? How do you alleviate that pressure both on those customers and on those companies? I think is a question that we're all trying to grapple with. I mean, I think you see it with respect to the airlines who've got the most public bailout thus far, as well as the program for all the small businesses. The requirement has always been, if you're going to get money, you've got to keep your workers on, right? You can't furlough anybody. And two, at least in this case, you can't cut people off. But I think there's going to be a question of, okay, if you're going to be providing businesses with funds, which I understand. Like, again, it's they are feeling a pinch as well. It's the same conversation that we have with renters and landlords. Renters can't pay their rent, which we're sympathetic to, but obviously there are landlords that have to pay their mortgages as well. We understand that as well. And so you have to do it. You just have to make sure whatever we do with respect to the business side, that you're doing it in a way that benefits and keeps these business afloat, one, but also two, ensures you're benefiting their customers. And I think that's the key component that needs to be ensured.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is for folks who haven't been able to pay but haven't been disconnected, which I'm supportive of that. You can't be disconnected right now. That's a real is a bad word, but lifeline, right? I don't mean to mix the terms here, but these are not forgiveness of payments pledges though, right? So at some point you're going to have 3 or 4 months of your bills due at some point. And I have a difficult time imagining a family that's struggling today being able to pay 4 times that amount in a couple months. So I think Joey's right that there's also a business angle here we have to be thoughtful of, and the economic structure of these businesses is such that they feel the economic lag 30 days later than everybody else, because you pay everyone who the 2 million people who are unemployed that the Department of Labor announced yesterday, all those people have a 30-day lag when their next bill is due, right? So that ripple effect that folks talk about, this is real. And every time there's an economic shock, it really does impact every company and every person. So we are worried about those questions, and it's we're going to have to grapple with that.
And the only thing else I would say, Kelsey, is that, from our perspective and the way my boss has been talking about it, and then I definitely I got to make a plug for the last slide here, for the last column separately, is from our perspective, the next stimulus bill isn't the last stimulus bill. Asad's right. This is going to be a long economic downturn that's going to have terrible ripple effects throughout the economy, on the consumer side, on the business side, pushing people and companies into debt and into terrible economic straits. And so Congress needs to continue to remain committed to the American people for years to come. We're trying to meet the tremendous needs that exist today, right now, make sure that people are connected. But this thing is sadly going to go on for years. Even if a vaccine was created and it was deployed early next year, I mean, Assad's right. You're going to have people that have missed months and months and months of bills. And there's going to be companies that have missed months and months and months of revenue. What are we going to do about it? I think is an enormous problem that Congress, we have to be serious about it and how we're going to do that so that we can have a swift recovery. I just want to mention the last column. 10 years ago, the last time we had a terrible economic downturn, the Great Recession, my boss inserted a provision in the Recovery Act, in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, R of 2009, that said, yeah, UFCC, you got to come up with a vision, a plan, a national broadband plan of what we need to ensure that we're keeping up with our ever insatiable desire and demand for connectivity. And it's been 10 years, and the plan has been very effective at pushing more spectrum allocation and the like. But it's been 10 years, and one, on that fact alone, it should be updated. But two, I mean, the world's different now. Even when we finally come out of the fog of Corona, and we are finally all able to shake each other's hands or maybe shake each other's hands, but at least be in the same room and talk to each other and share a beer, the world's going to have changed. The way we learn will have changed. The way we conduct medicine will have changed. The way we work will have changed. And, if we're going to continue to lead as a society and continue to ensure that our economy stays ahead, we're going to need a plan for what type of broadband and what type of connectivity we need once this whole thing's over.
Right. Well, we are running up into time here. It looks like, John, you're unmuted. If there was something you want to say, I definitely want to let you get that in. And I wanted to see if maybe we can address one or two audience questions very quickly.
Joey, if I could ask you real quickly.
I'm having a cameo for my 3-year-old.
Oh, wonderful. Well, bring her in to the conversation.
What's going on, Sam?
Well,
I'm here.
You're here. The simple question I wanted to ask you is, we love the idea of an updated national broadband plan. I don't believe the bill was introduced yet, so I wanted to get a sense from you of when that's going to be introduced and what we can do to help.
Yeah, we announced it. We haven't physically introduced it yet. It's unlike the House, where you're allowed to electronically introduce things. And they've entered 2020. The Senate is stuck in the 18th century or the 19th century, and you have to physically introduce a bill still. And so there's all sorts of health complications, as you can imagine. But we will get a bill number. Don't worry. The bill, the text is on our website, and we will have an S number at some point. And that is, just like the Supreme Court, that is the sound of a flushing toilet. But that is my 3-year-old who just thank you, Sam, for bombing this Zoom call.
That's funny.
Great. Well, do we have time for a lightning round of audience questions?
Sure.
Someone asks, what actions state legislatures or state policymakers can do to support these national efforts at broadband?
So I think a number of states, California included, have been pretty thoughtful well before this pandemic about connectivity for their residents. And I think they're going through the same exercise that, you hear some of the work in progress of the thinking of people like Joey and me. I think everyone's kind of in a similar spot. And so the one of the things we want to be very cognizant of is that these efforts are not competing and that they're complementary of each other, right? We should not be crowding out anything that states are able to do. We should be supportive of that at the federal level. And so to the degree we try to reach out to states when we're crafting legislation, but to the degree that anybody out there is seeing things that they see are problematic, please reach out. We want to hear about that, so that we can be thoughtful about the approach and make sure that, I mean, my boss keeps saying this is an all of society response. It's not just federal government, it's state government, local government, hospital, everybody's involved, right? So we want to work together.
The only other thing I want to put out a plug for Muni Broadband right now. There was a great article that ran in the Post a couple days ago in the Metro section, the Washington Post, about how the couple dozen states that have restrictions on providing municipal broadband is actually impeding the ability of schools and libraries and other public institutions to deploy some of their Wi-Fi networks beyond the limits of their school. And so obviously we're very in support of Muni Broadband and very opposed to all those state restrictions on it. But I thought it was a very interesting, it was an interesting observation that I don't think anybody expected that, Muni Broadband, these Muni Broadband restrictions would have such a detrimental impact right now as we're in the coronavirus pandemic.
And I'll put in a shameless plug for the Community Broadband Act, won by Anna Eshoo.
We're a co-sponsor in the Senate. Booker's the lead.
There you go. To make sure that those restrictive state laws don't stand.
Excellent. Well, it has been great chatting with you all. I think we're up against time, but I will turn this over to John for any wrap-up comments. Thanks again for having me.
Well, thanks, Kelsey. This has been a fabulous conversation, and we're already getting some compliments in the chat box. So thank you for all of you who participated in the conversation. The Shelby Coalition is happy to provide these webinars as a free public service to those who are interested in following these broadband developments. But I want to also encourage you to consider joining the Shelby Coalition. We are a membership organization. We now have about 200 members that participate from across the country, including schools, libraries, public interest groups, companies, nonprofit providers, and commercial providers. So we have a big tent of organizations that join Shelby to support our mission, which is to promote open, affordable, high-capacity broadband for anchor institutions and their communities. So we will also be updating the legislative tracker. Several of our speakers mentioned bills that aren't in the tracker that I've developed so far. So we will be incorporating some of your comments and in updating that tracker for the Shelby membership. And we'll look forward to be sending that out next week. As Alicia noted in the chat, we did record this webinar. We will be making that webinar available to everybody on our website. That will probably be up tomorrow, and then that will be available to the general public for the next 30 days. And then after that, it goes into the members only portal of our website. So thank you again for joining. This has been a fabulous discussion. I know there's many more questions that we didn't have a chance to answer today, but please stay in touch with us. And we're going to be working with not only Asad and Joey and Kelsey going forward, but many other congressional staff over the next 2 months to try to get these the most we can out of the broadband legislation that may be coming down the pike. So thank you all very much for joining.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.